There is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean that holds a secret the ancient world could not keep. For centuries, the Greeks told stories about it, stories of a king so powerful that the cities of the mainland paid him tribute in the form of their own children. Stories of a palace so vast and so complex that no one who entered it without guidance could ever find their way out. Stories of a creature that lived in the darkness beneath that palace, half man, half bull, fed on human flesh, waiting in the labyrinthine dark. Stories of a civilization so magnificent, so advanced, so unlike anything that came before or after it in the early world, that later generations could only explain it as the work of gods. The Greeks called the king Minos. They called the palace the Labyrinth. They called the creature the Minotaur. And for 2,000 years, educated people assumed these were myths, poetic inventions. The way that early civilizations make sense of a past they cannot directly remember, by turning history into legend and legend into myth until the original reality is buried beneath layers of story so thick that the truth seems unreachable. Then in the spring of 1900, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began to dig in a field on the northern coast of Crete. What he found beneath the soil was not a myth, it was a palace covering more than 20,000 square meters, a palace with running water and flushing toilets at a time when such things did not exist anywhere else in Europe. A palace decorated with paintings of such grace and color and life that the archaeologists who first uncovered them stood in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. A palace that had been buried for 3,000 years and that had been waiting with the patience of stone for someone to come and find it. Arthur Evans found it, and in finding it he found an entire civilization, one that no one in the modern world had known existed. A civilization that preceded classical Greece by 1,000 years, that built the first cities in Europe, that mastered seafaring at a time when most of the Mediterranean was still afraid of deep water. He named them the Minoans, after the legendary king whose palace this appeared to be. And the more he excavated, the more it became clear that the legends had been trying, in their imperfect human way, to remember something true. The labyrinth was real, the palace was real, the civilization was real. And its story, the story of its rise, its extraordinary flowering, and its mysterious end, is one of the most compelling in the entire ancient world. This is the Minoan Civilization, and it begins on an island. To understand the Minoans, you must first understand Crete. Not Crete as it is today, the tourist destination, the summer island of white houses and blue water and ancient ruins visited by millions. Crete as it was at the beginning. Before the tourists, before the Greeks, before the Romans, before anyone had heard of King Minos or the Minotaur or the Labyrinth. Crete as geography, Crete as possibility. The island lies at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, roughly equidistant between the Greek mainland, the coast of Asia Minor, the Levantine shore, and the coast of North Africa. It is the largest island in the Aegean, approximately 260 kilometers long, between 12 and 60 kilometers wide, oriented east to west, like a long, irregular banner stretched across the sea. Its terrain is dramatic. A spine of mountains runs along its length, rising to nearly 2,500 meters at the peak of Mount Ida. Mount Ida, where Greek mythology would later say that Zeus himself was born and raised, hidden from his murderous father Kronos, in a cave in the mountain's flank. The mountains of Crete are not gentle. They are the mountains of a Mediterranean island, rocky, wild, deeply cut by gorges that run from the central peaks down to the coast, carrying the winter rains to the sea in torrents that dry to nothing by summer. Between the mountains and the sea, the land is fertile. The valleys of Crete accumulate deep soils, watered by the mountain runoff and warmed by the Mediterranean sun. Olive trees grow in these valleys with a density and productivity that is extraordinary even by Mediterranean standards. Grapes grow on the hillsides, grain grows on the valley floors. The sea provides fish, shellfish, sea urchins, and the navigational opportunities that an island people learn to exploit. Crete, in other words, is a place where you can feed yourself, where the agricultural base is sufficient to sustain a substantial population without extraordinary effort, where the sea is not a barrier but a road, and the location of that road is crucial. Stand at the northern coast of Crete and look north. The Cycladic islands are visible on the horizon, stepping stones toward the Greek mainland. Look east, the coast of Asia Minor, and beyond it, the routes to Mesopotamia and the Persian plateau. Look south, Egypt, the Nile, the oldest and richest civilization in the Mediterranean world. Look west, the Western Mediterranean, Sicily, the Italian peninsula, the routes toward the Atlantic. Crete sits at the intersection of all of these. It is not at the center of the Mediterranean in a strictly geographic sense. But in terms of connectivity, in terms of the number of important trading partners, the number of significant civilizations, the number of routes that could be accessed by a skilled maritime people based here, it is as central as any point in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Minoans did not choose their location by accident, or rather, the civilizational advantages of this location meant that whoever first developed a complex society here would inherit those advantages. And the people who developed that complex society were the Minoans. The earliest human settlement of Crete dates to approximately the 7th millennium BCE, the Neolithic period, when agriculture was just beginning to spread westward from its origins in the Near East. The island's first settlers were farmers and herders living in small villages using stone tools and leaving the kind of archaeological footprint that is modest but unmistakable: pottery sherds, animal bones, the traces of wooden structures that the soil absorbs over millennia. For thousands of years, Crete was inhabited but not distinguished, a fertile island in the Aegean, populated by people who were doing what people across the Mediterranean were doing: farming, fishing, trading locally, building villages. And then, around 3000 BCE, something changed. The change was gradual rather than sudden, but its direction was clear and its momentum was sustained. Settlements grew larger, craft production became more specialized and more skilled. Evidence of long-distance trade, obsidian from the island of Melos, copper from Cyprus, goods from Egypt and the Levant, began to appear in Cretan archaeological contexts. The social structures that produce complexity, hierarchy, specialization, surplus production, the administrative apparatus that manages all of these began to emerge. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, they had produced something that the ancient world had never seen before in Europe. They had produced Knossos. The palace of Knossos did not appear fully formed in the archaeological record. It grew. The site had been occupied since the Neolithic period. For thousands of years before anything resembling a palace was built there, people had been living on the low hill above the Kefala stream, in the valley a few kilometers south of the north coast of Crete. The soil was fertile, the water was reliable, and the location gave good access to both the agricultural hinterland and the coastal trade. The first palace at Knossos, what archaeologists call the Old Palace or proto-palatial structure, was built around 1900 BCE. It was already, by the standards of contemporary Europe, an extraordinary structure, a complex multi-story building organized around a central courtyard with storage facilities, administrative spaces, and what appeared to be ceremonial areas. But the palace that Arthur Evans excavated, the palace that became famous, the palace that tourists visit today, was the new palace, rebuilt after a catastrophic earthquake destroyed the original structure around 1700 BCE. The reconstruction was not merely a repair, it was an expansion, an elaboration, a statement of renewed ambition after the disaster. The new palace of Knossos covered an area of approximately 20,000 square meters. Its footprint was roughly 150 meters by 100 meters, an area the size of several city blocks. It contained, by various estimates, between 1,200 and 1,500 rooms across multiple stories. Walk through it, and the Greek myth of the labyrinth begins to make immediate sense. The palace was not organized on a simple grid. It grew organically over centuries, with new wings added to existing structures, corridors connecting spaces that had previously been separate, staircases rising and descending through a three-dimensional maze of rooms and spaces that had no single obvious organizing principle. Or rather, had an organizing principle so complex and so specific to the needs and activities it was designed to serve that it appears, from the outside, as organized chaos. The central courtyard was the heart of the complex, a rectangular open space approximately 27 by 60 meters, around which the principal wings of the palace were arranged. The courtyard was paved with gypsum slabs, and it received light and air into the deep interior of the building. It was also, most scholars believe, the location of the most dramatic Minoan ritual activity, the bull leaping. Minoan art depicts bull leaping repeatedly, in frescoes, in bronze figurines, in carved ivory. The scene is always essentially the same, a great bull in full charge, and a human figure, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes both in the same scene, performing an acrobatic leap over the bull's back, grasping the horns, somersaulting over the animal's body, landing on the other side. Whether this was a real athletic practice, or a religious ritual, or a symbolic representation, or some combination of all three, scholars continue to debate. What is clear is that it was central to Minoan visual culture, and that the bull was a creature of profound religious and symbolic significance. The horns of the bull appear everywhere at Knossos, as architectural ornaments, as religious symbols, as the recurring image through which the Minoans expressed something essential about their relationship to power, to nature, to the divine. And in the Greek myth, the bull becomes the Minotaur, the creature at the center of the labyrinth, the dark heart of the Minoan world. Perhaps the myth was trying to say something true. Beyond the central courtyard, the palace unfolded in all directions. To the west, the throne room complex, the most famous single space in all of Minoan archaeology. A relatively small room, perhaps 10 meters by 8, with a stone throne set against the north wall, flanked by painted griffins on either side, and with gypsum benches lining the other walls. The throne is still there. It is the oldest throne in Europe still in its original position. Whoever sat on it, and scholars debate whether it was a king, a queen, or a high priest, sat in the presence of extraordinary symbolic weight. The room was not large. Power, in the Minoan world, did not always require scale to be felt. Adjacent to the throne room, a lustral basin, a sunken, pillar-lined space accessed by a short staircase used for ritual purification. Water was central to Minoan religious practice in ways that archaeology is still working to fully understand. To the east of the central court, the royal apartments, or what Evans interpreted as such. Multi-story residential spaces equipped with the remarkable engineering features that most distinguish Knossos from contemporary structures. The plumbing. Knossos had running water, not in the metaphorical sense that some ancient sites had access to water nearby. Actual running water delivered through terracotta pipes that were sealed with clay and tapered at their joints to maintain pressure, a technical feature that reflects genuine understanding of hydraulic principles. The palace also had flushing toilets, or at least latrine facilities that used water to carry waste away through a drainage system. Knossos' drainage system is sophisticated, separate channels for rainwater and sewage built from carefully fitted stone running beneath the floors of the palace to outlets that drained away from the building. The palace also had light wells, open vertical shafts that brought daylight and air into the deep interior of the multi-story structure, solving the problem of lighting and ventilation in a complex building without windows on the outer walls. These are not primitive solutions. These are engineering responses to real problems. The problems of building a large, complex, multi-use structure in a warm climate and making it habitable for a substantial population. The solutions the Minoan architects developed were, in some respects, not rediscovered in Europe until the Roman period, more than 1,000 years later. Knossos was not the only Minoan palace. The island of Crete supported at least 4 major palatial centres: Knossos in the north, Phaistos in the south, Malea on the north coast east of Knossos, and Zakros at the far eastern end of the island. Each had its own character, its own architectural personality, its own regional role. Phaistos, in the fertile Messara plain, was an important agricultural centre. Malea had close connections to the sea and maritime trade. Zakros, at the island's eastern tip, was positioned to control trade with the eastern Mediterranean, with Cyprus, with the Levantine coast, with Egypt. Together, these palatial centres formed a network. Not a centralised state in the modern sense, the Minoans were not Rome, not a unified empire administered from a single capital. They were something more like a civilization of city-states, bound together by shared culture, shared religion, and the commercial ties of an active trading economy. But Knossos was, by every measure, the greatest of them. When Arthur Evans's excavations began to uncover the painted walls of Knossos, there were moments of extraordinary stillness in the excavation trenches. A pickaxe would strike something solid, the earth would be carefully removed, and there, preserved by the collapse of the wall above it, protected by the very destruction that had buried the palace, would be a fragment of painted plaster. Not a brown or faded smear, not the ghost of a colour. A vivid, bright, confidently applied painting, blue and red and saffron yellow and the white of plaster ground, depicting figures and animals and landscapes with an ease and energy that seemed, to the excavators looking at it in the early 20th century, almost modern. The Minoan frescoes are among the most remarkable paintings in the ancient world. They cover a vast range of subjects. There are the famous scenes of bull leaping, the acrobatic figures against a red ground, the bull's body horizontal with the force of its charge, the human figures frozen in the moment of their extraordinary leap. There is the procession fresco, depicting a long line of figures bearing offerings toward an unseen destination, their bodies shown in the characteristic Minoan convention of blue-black skin for men, white skin for women. There are the blue monkeys, painted monkeys, moving through a landscape of crocuses, part of a larger nature scene from the residential apartments. There is the extraordinary dolphins fresco from the Queen's Megaron, dolphins and fish moving through painted water with a naturalism and grace that seems to celebrate the sea rather than merely depict it. And there is the Prince of the Lilies, a striding figure, human, male, wearing an elaborate headdress of lilies and peacock feathers, his posture one of relaxed authority. He is sometimes interpreted as a priest-king, sometimes as a worshipper in a ceremonial procession. Whatever his role, the painting is one of the icons of Minoan art. A single human figure carrying the visual weight of an entire civilization's sense of its own dignity. What is immediately striking about Minoan fresco painting, to any eye that has spent time with the monumental art of Egypt or the Near East, is its relationship to motion. Egyptian art freezes its subjects in rigid, formalized poses designed for eternal legibility rather than naturalistic accuracy. The Minoan painters preferred something else. Their figures move, their animals run, their plants bend in a wind that you can almost feel. The dolphins of Knossos seem genuinely to swim. The bull leapers are caught in the middle of something, not posed at the beginning or end of it. This is not merely a stylistic preference. It reflects something about how the Minoans understood the world they depicted as a place of energy and movement, of life in continuous flow rather than permanent, fixed form. The natural world is everywhere in Minoan art. Animals, plants, water, the sea, the rocks of the coastline. These appear not as backgrounds for human activity, but as subjects in their own right, worthy of detailed, careful, affectionate observation. The lily fresco from Mnissos, the papyrus fresco from Knossos, the extraordinary landscapes from Crete on the island of Thera, a Minoan-influenced settlement that was preserved intact by the volcanic eruption that buried it, giving us our clearest picture of Minoan wall painting in its full context. At Crete, entire rooms are covered floor to ceiling in painted landscapes. Blue monkeys, swallows, lilies, the sea, the coastline. One room, the spring fresco room, depicts a rocky landscape covered in red lilies, with swallows swooping between the blossoms in the kind of specific, observed detail that only comes from spending a long time watching something real. The Minoan painters watched the world, and then they painted what they saw with a confidence and delight that has never lost its power to move the people who look at it 3,500 years later. In the storage magazines beneath the Palace of Knossos, Arthur Evans's excavators discovered a series of small rooms, the temple repositories that had been sealed and then crushed by the collapse of the structure above them. When the debris was carefully removed, the contents of these rooms proved extraordinary. Among the objects recovered were two small faience figurines, glazed ceramic, each about 30 centimeters tall, depicting a woman in the distinctive Minoan style of dress, a tiered skirt, an open bodice that exposes the breasts, an elaborate headdress. In her outstretched hands, snakes. One figurine holds snakes that coil up her arms and over her head. The other holds snakes in both hands, extended outward, the snakes' heads turning toward the viewer. The faces of both figures are direct, calm, and, despite the snakes, without any expression of fear or alarm. These are the snake goddesses of Knossos, and they are among the most iconic objects of Minoan civilization. What they represent has been debated ever since Evans found them. The most common interpretation is that they depict a goddess, perhaps the Minoan goddess, a female divine figure who was the supreme deity of the Minoan religious world. The snake was a creature of deep symbolic significance across many ancient cultures, associated with the earth, with regeneration, with the cyclic renewal of life. In the Minoan context, the snake's association with the ground, with the domestic space, with the world beneath the human, all of these resonate with what we know of Minoan religious emphasis on the natural world as a sphere of the divine. The open bodice, the exposed breasts, speaks of fertility, of the female body as a source of nourishment and life. This is a goddess of life, of the living world, of the earth that produces the grain, the vine that produces the grape, the body that produces the child. This reading is supported by the broader evidence of Minoan religion, which differs strikingly from the religious traditions of the Near Eastern civilizations that the Minoans traded with and were influenced by. Egyptian religion was dominated by a complex pantheon of anthropomorphic deities, each with specialized functions and elaborate mythological histories. Mesopotamian religion was similar. The divine world of these cultures was populated by individualized gods and goddesses who quarreled, loved, competed, and intervened in human affairs in ways that mirrored human political and social life. The Minoan divine world, and as far as we can reconstruct it, seems to have been organized around a different principle. Nature itself was sacred: the mountains, the caves, the trees, the sea. These were not merely locations where divine activity happened. They were, in some sense, divine in themselves. The Minoans worshipped in peak sanctuaries, small shrine sites on prominent hilltops across Crete, where offerings were deposited in quantities that suggest regular and widespread religious practice by ordinary people, not just an elite priestly class. They worshipped in cave sanctuaries, the caves of the Cretan mountains that served as sacred spaces over many centuries, accumulating deposits of offerings and evidence of ritual activity across enormous time spans. The cave of Psychro, a stalactite cave in the mountains of eastern Crete that tradition identifies as the birthplace of Zeus, has been a sacred site since the Minoan period, and they worshipped in the palaces themselves, in the small shrine rooms and lustral basins that punctuate the residential and administrative spaces, integrating the sacred into the fabric of everyday life in a way that the great temples of Egypt and Mesopotamia, segregated in their own precincts, did not. The role of women in Minoan religious life appears to have been central. The snake goddesses, the figures in the frescoes who preside over ritual scenes, the female worshippers who appear in the peak sanctuary deposits, the elaborate female costumes depicted in Minoan art, costumes that would require enormous resources to produce and that suggest a social role for elite women that was genuinely prominent and genuinely public. Whether the Minoan world was a matriarchy in any formal political sense is something the evidence cannot establish clearly, but that women occupied important positions in Minoan religious and perhaps political life seems highly probable. In a world where most ancient civilizations were organized around male power at every level, political, military, religious, the Minoan emphasis on the female divine and on women's public ritual roles stands as something genuinely distinctive. The Minoans did not build walls around their cities. This fact, in the context of the ancient Bronze Age Mediterranean, where fortification was the standard architectural response to the threat of violence from neighboring states, is remarkable. It requires an explanation. The explanation most often proposed is the sea. Crete is an island, and the Minoans, by the height of their civilization in the 16th and 15th centuries BCE, controlled the sea around it with a thoroughness that made walls unnecessary. No enemy fleet could approach Crete without the Minoans knowing about it. No enemy army could land on the island without facing a Minoan naval response. The Greek historian Thucydides, writing 1,000 years after the height of Minoan power, but drawing on traditions that preserve the memory of it, describes Minos as having established the first thalassocracy, the first seaborne empire, the first civilization whose power was fundamentally maritime rather than territorial. Thalassocracy. Rule of the sea. Whether this ancient attribution is historically precise is debated, but the archaeological evidence strongly supports the picture of a civilization whose power was inseparable from its mastery of seafaring. Minoan pottery has been found across an enormous geographic range, in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus, across the Aegean Islands, on the Greek mainland, in Anatolia. The distribution of these objects reflects not just passive trading contact, but active Minoan commercial engagement across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. The port town of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, buried by the volcanic eruption of the mid-2nd millennium BCE, and thus preserved with extraordinary completeness, reveals a Minoan-influenced settlement of sophisticated urban character, with multi-story buildings, elaborate frescoes, and the material culture of a prosperous trading community. The Minoan influence at Akrotiri was not the influence of casual contact. It was pervasive and deep. The frescoes, the pottery, the architecture, the urban organization all reflect Minoan models. Akrotiri was not a Minoan colony in the formal sense, but it was a place where Minoan culture had taken strong root. Similar evidence of Minoan cultural influence appears across the Cycladic islands, along the Anatolian coast, and in the early Mycenaean culture of the Greek mainland. The Minoans exported not just goods, but ideas, art styles, religious practices, architectural forms. The prestige of Minoan culture was such that the elites of neighboring civilizations wanted to possess Minoan things, to build in Minoan styles, to participate in what the Minoans represented. What did Minoan trade carry? The storage magazines of the Minoan palaces, vast underground rooms filled with enormous ceramic storage jars, the pithoi, some of them taller than a human being, held the agricultural surplus that was the economic foundation of the system. Olive oil, wine, grain. These were produced in the fertile valleys of Crete and processed through the palatial administrative system before being exported in exchange for the goods that Crete could not produce locally. Copper and tin, the components of bronze, were the most essential imports. Crete has no significant metal ore deposits. The Bronze Age required bronze, and bronze required copper from Cyprus, and tin from sources as distant as Afghanistan and possibly Britain. The Minoans paid for these metals with their agricultural surplus and their craft goods, the fine pottery, the metalwork, the textiles that Cretan craftsmen produced at a level of skill that made them desirable luxury goods across the Mediterranean. Egypt was a particularly important trading partner. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period, roughly contemporary with the height of Minoan power, depict Keftiu, the Egyptian name for Crete or its people, as bearers of tribute or trade goods. The Keftiu figures in Egyptian tomb paintings carry Minoan-style vessels and wear Minoan-style dress, depicted with enough specificity that modern scholars can compare the painted objects to actual Minoan artifacts and confirm the identification. Minoan merchants were known in Egypt. Egyptian merchants traded in Crete. The two civilizations were in regular, sustained contact, each benefiting from what the other had to offer. The Minoans also had connections further east, to the Levantine cities of the coast, to the trading networks of Cyprus, to the broader commercial world of the Eastern Mediterranean that Bronze Age archaeological evidence reveals as more integrated and more long-distance than was once appreciated. The Minoans were not peripheral to this world, they were at its center. The Minoans wrote, "This is not surprising for a civilization of their complexity and commercial activity. An economy that managed the production, storage, and export of large quantities of agricultural goods, that administered tribute from subordinate settlements, that tracked the movement of goods in and out of enormous palatial storerooms, requires record-keeping, it requires writing. The Minoan writing system is called Linear A. It is called linear to distinguish it from the earlier Cretan writing system, the Cretan hieroglyphic script, which used more pictographic symbols, and from its descendant, Linear B, which was adapted from it by the Mycenaeans to write an early form of Greek. Linear A appears on clay tablets, on stone vessels, on bronze objects, on gold and silver pins. It appears in administrative contexts, the clay tablets that record inventories, transactions and accounts, and in what appear to be religious or dedicatory contexts, where inscribed objects were offered at Minoan shrines. The signs of Linear A are clearly related to the signs of Linear B, similar enough that scholars who can read Linear B can identify individual Linear A signs and understand their approximate phonetic values. But reading Linear A is not the same as understanding it. Linear B records an early form of Greek, a language that scholars know that can be translated, that connects to a known linguistic tradition. When Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B in 1952, he was able to read the tablets because the language beneath the script was recoverable. Linear A records the Minoan language, and the Minoan language is not Greek. it is not related to any known language in a way that allows translation. Every attempt to read Linear A as though it were an early form of some known language has failed, because the language beneath the script is not a known language. It is the language of a civilization that has no surviving descendants, no linguistic relatives, no textual bridge connecting it to anything we already understand. The tablets of Linear A, thousands of them spread across Minoan sites from Knossos to Zakros, from Akrotiri to the small peak sanctuaries of the Cretan mountains, contain information we cannot access. Inventory lists probably, administrative records, the details of how the Minoan economy functioned at the level of day-to-day management, and perhaps more, religious texts, royal inscriptions, narrative accounts of events that were important enough to record. We cannot read them. The Minoans are speaking to us across 3,500 years in a language we have not yet learned to understand. It is one of the most tantalizing silences in the ancient world. The tablets are there. The writing is clear. The signs can be identified, but the meaning remains locked in a language that died with the civilization that used it, leaving no key behind. The decipherment of Linear A, if it ever comes, would be one of the most significant intellectual achievements in the history of archaeology. It would open a window into the Minoan world that no excavation, no fresco, no artifact can match. The window of the Minoans' own words. Until then, we look at their paintings and their buildings and their objects, and we try to understand a civilization through what it made rather than through what it said. The relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans is one of the most complex and consequential in the ancient world. The Mycenaeans were the people of the Greek mainland, the civilization that built the shaft graves at Mycenae, the Lion Gate, the massive fortified citadels of Tiryns and Athens and Pylos and Orchomenos. The civilization that Homer would later mythologize in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the world of Agamemnon and Achilles, of Troy and the 10-year war. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Mycenaeans were a developing culture on the Greek mainland, in contact with the Minoans through trade and cultural exchange. The influence of Minoan culture on early Mycenaean civilization is unmistakable and extensive. Mycenaean palace architecture borrowed Minoan forms. Mycenaean art adopted Minoan conventions of representation. The Linear B writing system was adapted directly from Linear A. The Mycenaeans took the Minoan writing system, adjusted it to fit the very different phonological structure of their own language, and used it to administer their own palace economies. The Mycenaeans were, in this period, students of the Minoans. They admired Minoan culture, imported Minoan goods, adopted Minoan practices, and measured their own developing sophistication against the standard that the Minoan world set. And then, sometime in the 15th century BCE, the relationship changed. The precise nature and timing of the Mycenaean takeover of Crete is one of the most debated questions in Aegean prehistory. The evidence is complex and in some respects contradictory, and the scholarly literature reflects genuine uncertainty about what happened. What the evidence shows is this: by approximately 1450 BCE, Mycenaean Linear B tablets appear at Knossos. Mycenaean pottery styles replace or supplement Minoan ones across the island. Mycenaean burial practices appear in Cretan cemeteries. The material culture of Knossos changes in ways that suggest a new political and administrative authority. One using Greek, not the Minoan language. The Mycenaeans were governing Crete, or at least governing Knossos. How this happened is unclear. Was it conquest? Military force? A fleet of Mycenaean warriors arriving on the Cretan coast? Was it political takeover? The installation of a Mycenaean ruling house through diplomacy? marriage alliance, or the exploitation of internal Minoan political conflict? Was it a gradual process rather than a single event? The archaeological record does not answer these questions cleanly. What it shows is destruction at some Minoan sites around this period and continuity at others. It shows the Linear B administration at Knossos continuing for perhaps another century or more after the apparent political transition. It shows a Crete that retained much of its Minoan character, even as its administration was conducted in Greek. The Minoans did not simply disappear when the Mycenaeans arrived. Their culture was too embedded in the physical fabric of the island, in the buildings, the art, the religious traditions, the agricultural practices, to be erased quickly or completely. But the Minoan civilization as an independent, distinctive political and cultural entity, that was coming to an end. In the middle of the Aegean Sea, roughly 110 kilometers north of the northern coast of Crete, there is a cluster of islands arranged in a rough circle. The circle is not coincidental. It is the remnant of a volcanic caldera, the collapsed summit of a massive stratovolcano whose catastrophic eruption in the 2nd millennium BCE produced one of the largest volcanic events in the recorded history of the ancient world. The island group is called Thera in ancient sources. Today it is better known as Santorini. The eruption of Thera was extraordinary by any measure. The volume of material ejected was perhaps 4 to 5 times that of the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, an eruption that caused global temperature drops, spectacular sunsets across the northern hemisphere, and a tsunami that killed tens of thousands of people. The Thera eruption buried the Bronze Age town of Akrotiri under meters of volcanic ash. The same eruption that preserved it so perfectly, the same eruption whose deposits have made Akrotiri one of the most informative Bronze Age sites in the Mediterranean. But Thera is close to Crete. Close enough that the eruption's effects on Crete itself would have been severe. Tsunami waves generated by the caldera collapse would have struck the northern coast of Crete with devastating force. The Minoan harbour towns on the north coast, the commercial and maritime infrastructure on which the trading economy depended, would have been hit directly. Volcanic ash from the eruption has been found in Cretan soil deposits. The ashfall would have damaged crops, contaminated water sources, and disrupted the agricultural cycle that sustained the palatial economy. The atmospheric effects of a major volcanic eruption, the injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the temporary cooling of surface temperatures, the disruption of rainfall patterns, can persist for years and can have significant effects on agricultural productivity across wide areas. Here is where the debate begins. The traditional dating of the Thera eruption, established through pottery chronology and correlation with Egyptian historical records, placed it at approximately 1500 BCE. At this date, the eruption would have preceded the apparent Mycenaean takeover of Crete by about 50 years. But more recent evidence, from ice core analysis, from tree ring records, from radiocarbon dating of material from Akrotiri itself, suggests an earlier date, somewhere in the range of 1620 to 1600 BCE. This is a significant discrepancy, and it matters for understanding the relationship between the Thera eruption and the trajectory of Minoan civilization. If the later date is correct, the eruption preceded the apparent peak of Minoan power, the period of the finest frescoes, the most sophisticated palace architecture, the widest commercial reach, suggesting that Minoan civilization recovered from the eruption and continued to flourish for more than a century afterward. If the earlier date is correct, the same conclusion broadly applies, but the gap between the eruption and the final decline of Minoan power is even longer. In neither case does the Thera eruption appear to have been the direct, immediate cause of Minoan collapse. The relationship between the eruption and the later decline of Minoan civilization is probably more indirect. a weakening of the maritime infrastructure, a disruption of the trade networks that underpinned Minoan wealth, a diminution of the agricultural surplus that gave the palatial economy its power. Combined with the broader disruptions of the late Bronze Age world, the political instability that would eventually bring down palace civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, these factors may have contributed to a civilization that was, by the 15th century, less resilient than it had once been, less able to resist the pressure from the Mycenaean world, less able to sustain the complex interconnected system of palaces and trade and agricultural management that had made the Minoans extraordinary. The volcano did not kill the Minoans, but it may have set in motion the long process that weakened them. Around 1450 BCE, something happened to Minoan Crete. The palace sites across the island, with the exception of Knossos, show evidence of destruction. Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, Tylissos, Palaikastro. Site after site across the island reveals a destruction horizon at approximately this date. Burned timbers, collapsed walls, abandoned storerooms, still containing the pithoi and the goods that would have been taken if there had been time to take them. The destruction was not uniform. The sites were not all destroyed in the same way or necessarily at exactly the same moment. Some show evidence of fire, some show evidence of abandonment without obvious violence. Some were reoccupied quickly, others were not reoccupied at all. But the pattern is clear enough. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan palatial system, the network of palace centers that had organized Cretan life for 5 centuries, collapsed across most of the island. Only Knossos survived as a functioning palatial center. And Knossos in this period was showing the signs of Mycenaean administrative control. What caused the destructions? This is one of the great unanswered questions of Aegean prehistory, and the scholarly debate around it has been active and sometimes heated for more than a century. The candidates include Mycenaean military conquest, a fleet of Mycenaean warriors exploiting the weakened state of Minoan Crete, already disrupted by the Thera eruption's long-term effects, attacking and destroying the palace centers, leaving Knossos intact as the administrative seat of a new Mycenaean authority. This theory has the virtue of explaining the subsequent appearance of Mycenaean administration at Knossos, but the lack of clear evidence of military action at many destruction sites is problematic. Internal revolt. The Minoan palace system depended on a complex hierarchy of control. The palatial elite extracting tribute and labor from the agricultural population. If that system had become oppressive, or if the disruptions of the late 15th century had made it impossible for the palaces to fulfill their side of the implied contract, the provision of security, of religious ritual, of economic management, the agricultural population might have turned against the palace centers. Natural disaster. An earthquake or a series of earthquakes could have caused widespread destruction across the island simultaneously. The Aegean is seismically active, and there is evidence for major earthquakes at several Minoan sites. A combination of factors. The most historically realistic answer is probably that no single cause was responsible, that the Minoan palatial system, weakened by a series of disruptions over the preceding century or more, simply reached a threshold beyond which it could not recover. A combination of the Thera eruption's lingering effects, growing Mycenaean pressure, possible internal tensions, and perhaps a final seismic event may have brought down what had become a fragile system. What is clear is the result. After 1450 BCE, the Minoan civilization as it had existed was over. Knossos continued for another century or more under Mycenaean administration, but the civilization that had built it, the culture that had painted the dolphins and the bull leapers, that had worshipped the snake goddess and performed rituals at the peak sanctuaries, that had spoken the unreadable language of Linear A, that civilization was gone. It had lasted for more than 1,000 years. Its end, when it came, was neither clean nor fully understood, and the mystery of what exactly happened remains one of the most compelling puzzles in ancient history. The Mycenaeans did not simply replace the Minoans, they inherited them. The Linear B tablets from Knossos, the administrative records of the Mycenaean period of control, reveal a palace economy that was, in its fundamental structure, a continuation of the Minoan palatial system. The same kinds of goods were being tracked, the same kinds of agricultural management were being conducted, the same physical spaces, the storerooms, the workshops, the administrative areas of the palace were being used for the same purposes. The Mycenaeans had taken over the Minoan system because the system worked. They had adopted the Minoan writing system because it was efficient. They had preserved the Minoan palace because it was functional. But they were reading different things into the spaces they had inherited. The throne room at Knossos, which in the Minoan period had been a space for ritual that we do not fully understand, became in the Mycenaean period, the Linear B evidence is a guide, a center of administrative authority more recognizably similar to the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland. The religious traditions of the Minoans were partially absorbed into Mycenaean religion, and through Mycenaean religion into the later Greek religious world. The snake goddess has suggested to some scholars a continuity with the later Greek goddess Athena, who was also associated with snakes, who was also a protective deity of the city and its people. The Minoan double axe, the labyrintha, from which the word labyrinth may derive, appears in later Greek religious contexts. The bull, so central to Minoan religious symbolism, appears throughout Greek mythology in forms that seem to remember something Minoan. The bull of Poseidon, the Cretan bull that Heracles captured, the bull that fathered the Minotaur, the recurring divine bull that moves through Greek myth like a memory of something older. And then there is the myth itself, Theseus and the Minotaur. The Athenian hero who travels to Crete, navigates the labyrinth with the help of the Cretan princess Ariadne, kills the Minotaur, and ends the tribute that Athens paid to the Cretan king. This myth is a memory of something, not a literal record, but a story that preserves in the distorting mirror of mythological narrative some echo of the real relationship between the Aegean mainland and Minoan Crete, the tribute that the mainland paid, the labyrinthine complexity of the Cretan palace, the central role of the bull, the eventual ending of Cretan dominance. Myths are not history, but they are not random either. The Mycenaeans remembered the Minoans in their stories, and through those stories, the Greeks remembered the Mycenaeans, and through the Greeks the memory reached us. The legend was trying to preserve something true. Arthur Evans spent nearly 3 decades at Knossos. He was not merely an excavator in the conventional sense, he was also a reconstructor. And this is where his legacy becomes complicated. Evans rebuilt parts of Knossos. He used concrete, a material entirely foreign to the Bronze Age, to reconstruct columns, staircases, and sections of the palace that had collapsed. He commissioned artists to repaint the frescoes in their full form, based on the fragments that excavation revealed. The result is the Knossos that tourists visit today, a partially reconstructed palace, part ancient stone and part 20th century reinforced concrete. The frescoes, copies of fragments rather than originals. This raises genuine problems for the scholar and genuine questions for the visitor. How much of what we see at Knossos today reflects Bronze Age reality, and how much reflects Arthur Evans's interpretation of that reality? When Evans reconstructed the throne room, was he capturing something true about how it looked and functioned? Or was he imposing a 20th century vision onto fragmentary evidence? These questions matter because our understanding of Minoan civilization is built, to a significant degree, on Evans's excavations and Evans's interpretations. His choices about what to reconstruct and how shaped the image of the Minoans that the world received. More recent scholarship has revised some of Evans's conclusions. The chronology he established has been refined by radiocarbon dating and by more sophisticated pottery analysis. Some of his interpretive frameworks, particularly his tendency to see Knossos as a straightforwardly royal residence in the Victorian sense, have been questioned and partially replaced by more nuanced understandings of palatial function. The ongoing excavations at other Minoan sites, at the Minoan town of Palikastro, at the remarkable Minoan Peak Sanctuary of Petsofa, at the continuing work at Akrotiri on Thera, are providing new data that supplements and sometimes corrects the Knossos-centric picture that Evans established. Akrotiri deserves particular mention. The Theran town, excavated since the 1960s by Greek archaeologists, is in some ways a better preserved Minoan site than Knossos. Not because it was more important, but because the volcanic eruption that destroyed it also preserved it. No later construction disturbed the Bronze Age levels. No medieval quarrying removed the stone. No Arthur Evans reconstructed the walls. What survives at Akrotiri is the actual Bronze Age fabric, the actual painted walls in actual rooms, in actual buildings whose floor plans can be traced without ambiguity. The frescoes of Akrotiri, when first discovered, were still bright, the colors preserved under the ash for 3,500 years. New technologies continue to transform our understanding of Minoan civilization. Satellite imagery and geophysical survey, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistivity, allow archaeologists to map the buried remains of Minoan settlements without digging, revealing the extent and organization of sites that would take decades to excavate conventionally. Isotopic analysis of human remains from Minoan cemeteries is providing information about diet, health, movement, and population origins that the material culture alone cannot supply. Where did the Minoans come from? How mobile was the Minoan population? What did ordinary people eat, and how healthy were they? These are questions that the bones can begin to answer, even when the texts remain silent. The picture of Minoan civilization that emerges from this ongoing work is richer, more complex, and in some ways more surprising than the version that Evans constructed a century ago. The Minoans were not the peaceful, goddess-worshipping, violence-free utopia that some romantic interpretations have suggested. The evidence for ritual violence, the disturbing finds at Anemospilia, a Minoan shrine where the bodies of apparent human sacrificial victims were found, frozen by an earthquake at the moment of their killing, complicates any simple reading of Minoan culture as benign. They were a Bronze Age civilization. They had the strengths and the shadows that all Bronze Age civilizations had, but they were also genuinely extraordinary. In their art, in their architecture, in their engagement with the natural world, in the sophistication of their engineering and their commercial networks, in the grace and energy that pervades everything they left behind. They were extraordinary. And the mystery of their language, their end, and the full nature of their world ensures that they will continue to fascinate. The sea around Crete is still the same sea. The same Aegean that the Minoan ships crossed, heading north to the Cyclades, east to the Levantine coast, south to Egypt, still moves in the same patterns of wind and current that guided those ships 35 centuries ago. The same mountains of Crete still catch the winter clouds and release the water that fills the Cretan rivers. The same light still falls on the same limestone, producing the same colors, white and gold and the deep blue of deep water, that the Minoan painters captured in their frescoes. The dolphins of the Queen's Megaron were painted from life by someone who had watched dolphins in this sea. The swallows of the Akrotiri frescoes were painted from life by someone who had watched swallows over this landscape. The bull leapers were painted from life, or from a tradition so closely connected to life that the energy of the thing is still completely present in the image. That energy, that specific quality of life, caught and held in paint on plaster for 3,500 years. That is what the Minoans left us, not texts we can read, not a continuous tradition that survived into the present. Not descendants who carry the Minoan language forward in their speech. They left the image of a civilization that was alive, that moved through the world with confidence and curiosity, and a delight in the natural world that comes through in every painting, every seal stone, every piece of decorated pottery. Arthur Evans, looking at the frescoes in the spring of 1900, was looking at something he had not expected to find. A civilization of grace, a civilization that had built running water and painted dolphins and worshipped a snake goddess and leaped over bulls in a central courtyard. All of it vanished for 3,000 years, all of it waiting beneath a Cretan field for someone to come and look. He looked, and the Minoans looked back. They are still looking back. From the painted walls of Knossos, from the ash-preserved rooms of Crete, from the thousands of objects in the museums of Heraclion and Athens and Oxford, the Minoans are still present, still insisting on being seen, still offering us the image of a world that was real and complex and beautiful and strange. We cannot read their words, but we can see what they loved: the sea, the bull, the snake, the flower, the acrobat in midair, suspended above the charging bull for a moment that was already 3,500 years old before anyone who is alive today was born. Rest now. The sea is still moving. The same sea the Minoan ships crossed. The same sea that carried their trade and their ideas and their art to the farthest shores of the ancient world. It has not stopped. Good night.